I think the creative industry is a vanguard for facilitating an environment where autism or people who are on the spectrum become part of the community.
Welcome to the first episode of The Thought Cafe, where curious people discuss things that matter. I'm Julia and Jon, and I'll be hosting this interview series.
And my name's Jon Corbiere, and I'll be co-hosting this episode.
Today we'll be discussing autism and the creative industry. We'll be talking to Alex Shifrin, who has a unique perspective on this topic.
Alex was the former CEO at Saatchi Saatchi in Russia and is currently a managing partner at LPAD here in Toronto, Canada.
Not only is Alex a veteran in the advertising industry, but he's also the father of two sons, both of which have autism spectrum disorder. He's become inspired to look to his industry as a place for those on the spectrum to use their specific skills and talents.
Alex, like a lot of us, sort of thought he might understand what autism was, but really didn't have much experience with it and had to learn about it pretty quick when he realized that his first child, Greg, as a toddler, was showing signs of being on the spectrum.
We found out, or we began to suspect, that our older boy, who's now 5, has autism around when he was 2 years old, and I didn't really understand what it was. You've seen probably Rain Man or something, and you have some understanding of some exceptional skills, or the word that sometimes has been used is a savant, but you don't really understand what it is. So autism is a gap in communication, and people or individuals on the spectrum, they don't connect, they don't communicate, they don't necessarily see or hear what is being transmitted at them. And that's for various reasons. In some cases, it's because there's just a lot they're processing at the same time. They're hearing and seeing all the senses at an equal level, and there's just a lot of noise and distortion. Other times, they're just simply not connecting. But because there isn't this connection, this flow of information, there becomes just sort of a human disconnect. And if you look at kids, so, kids learn common behavior by seeing and imitating the way their parents behave. If kids aren't seeing some of the basic fundamental things that their parents are doing, they don't really develop, which is why you see kids on the spectrum that behave kind of quirky or have awkward social behaviors. They don't see those cues, and they never really imitated them. But that's sort of at its core what autism is. And it's very different. There's this sort of saying, if you know two people with autism, you know two people with autism. It isn't universal.
I think a lot of what we understand about autism is what we see in movies and in the media, but Alex definitely helped us understand more about it, and he kind of introduced us to this idea of the autism spectrum, which is a much more complete understanding.
The spectrum is kind of a wide berth of understanding. It's a bit of a catch-all. Autism it's not binary. It's not like you have a cold or you don't have a cold. It's a whole range of symptoms that, and the spectrum is comprised of ADHD, autism, a number of things. There's various apraxias, speech apraxia, things on the lower end or the higher end of the functioning spectrum.
Seems like autism is being discussed in medicine and in the media more than ever before. It's often framed as some sort of recent epidemic, and people seem to be looking for answers as to why so many children are getting an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. But is it really something new?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is that autism is wrapped up in an anti-vaccination campaign. There's a lot of fear around it, about people being different. As Alex mentioned to us, this type of behavior has been around for a very, very long time.
What I have noticed doing some research or doing some reading is you can look at some notable people in history, Albert Einstein, for example, even some historical figures like Mozart, recent figures like Amelia Earhart, even Steve Jobs. And they displayed some very classic behavior of people on the spectrum. So I suspect it's always been around and existed.
Yeah, so Alex is bringing up some obviously great thinkers, from the past century, and sort of mentioning that, these are all people who stood out for one reason or another, but were also people who sort of behaved on the spectrum. And it's interesting to see his thoughts unfolding and sort of moving towards this great big campaign that we're going to hear him talk about later, considered by many to be the most successful advertising campaign of all time, which in a weird, strange kind of meta way is celebrating the fact that all these people, sat on the spectrum.
The creative industry is a place that can be a home to people on the spectrum. And I did more research into autism and the spectrum itself, and it kind of occurred to me that the creative field has been a place for people on the spectrum for many, many years. And I think in many ways without even really knowing it. It celebrated it, or at least certain things about it, unknowingly.
So in 2015, Alex came across a scientific article in a medical journal which discussed how people on the spectrum think differently compared to those who aren't, especially when it came to creative thinking.
I was reading a report that was called The Relationship Between Subthreshold Autistic Traits, Ambiguous Figure Perception, and Divergent Thinking, published in the Journal of Autism and Development Disorders. But it talks about how people on the spectrum are programmed to think differently. So they did a series of tests. There's a sampling of about 350 people, and they asked them to look at common things like paper clips and identify alternative uses for these common items. And they found that people who were on the spectrum quantitatively gave more unique answers. I don't mean unique subjectively, as in, oh, that's kind of unique. I mean, as in, their responses were less than 5% of the common responses of the whole sample size. So they were actually, quantitatively different. People were asked, what is an alternative use for paperclip? A neurotypical response to that question would have been things like a pin or a fish hook or a piece of jewelry. People on the spectrum gave answers like a ballast for a paper airplane or chips for gambling. So the way that it works is, we have our left and our right hemispheres. The right hemisphere is generally what's attributed to the creative side. It's from associative memory, it's collective memories, things that come from common experiences. And generally, when you're trying to do problem solving, neurotypical behavior would be to start on the right side, the more creative side, and use references. So if a creative is going at a brief, that creative will often employ the right side of their brain hemisphere and come up with associations, which is often why you see things that come from collective media experiences kind of playing into communication and advertising. There is no original work out there. You often hear that being said, but one of the reasons is because we come at this from a collective experience. So the left hemisphere is the more logic based side. It's more rational. It's not looking at it from references or common experience. It's taking a problem, is deconstructing it into its parts, and then sort of systematically going at it and seeing if you can address it in a more structured and systematic function. So when you run out of ideas on the right side, you kind of move to the left and you start to you create solutions from a logic side.
It's interesting to look at the ad industry in this way. I think he's suggesting that there are probably a slew of, undiagnosed people on the spectrum that work in the creative industry successfully already. But he's also suggesting that the industry itself should be an opportunity for people on the spectrum to express themselves in creative ways.
So people on the spectrum, the right side of their brain, the one that answers, as they say, for the creativity, for the common experiences, the more sort of social behavior, it's impaired. It's one of the reasons that they are the way that they are. There isn't really a social common behavior that they have. There aren't the same references that they share with people. So people on the spectrum, their left side, the more logic side, not only is it not impaired, in some cases it tends to be more developed just because it's used more commonly. And the theory that came out of this piece was people on the spectrum approach problem solving differently because that's the way that they're wired.
So it seems so obvious while talking to Alex, but essentially what he's saying is that people on the spectrum literally think different.
Yeah, what Alex is saying is that they operate from essentially a different side of their brain first. Whereas creatives tend to think from their right hemisphere, people on the spectrum think using their left hemisphere.
I mean, we see this all the time here at the studio, but there is this tendency for this understanding that there seems to be no original ideas and there's this sort of collective ability to continually come up with the same solutions and the same ideas to problems. It can be really difficult to find an original solution.
Yeah, and I think that's why it makes so much sense that as a creative industry, we should be embracing people who think in a different way, because then we'll be coming to a lot more creative solutions to the types of problems that we have.
Yeah, and he also clearly sees this as an advantage or something to celebrate. And, the flip side of that is that it's something that's been celebrated for a long time within the industry. So it's already being celebrated, but most of us just don't really seem to acknowledge or understand this small sort of detail about thinking differently.
When Alex started his career in the advertising industry, it was right when the Think Different campaign had just come out, which is probably the most famous ad campaign by Apple. And the entire premise of this campaign was to feature historic figures who had made an impact on the world by being unconventional and by thinking differently.
The whole Think Different campaign, it talked about there's certain people that bucked convention, that did things different from the way that things were done. And because of their resistance to this convention, or at least because of their approach and the way that they thought differently, they were able to make some profound and fundamental changes. And there was a 1 minute film, commercial that they shot, and it was basically celebrating that. But it showed these people. There was Albert Einstein, Amelia Earhart, I think Bob Dylan was in there. But they kind of went through and selected some iconic figures who, just through their sheer willpower or because they thought differently, changed like humanity for the better. And Apple akin itself as sort of the challenger brand. I mean, I understand the brand thinking, but it also kind of it appealed to the creative community. And it just so happens that many of these people that changed the face of humanity, that thought differently, were on the spectrum. As I said, including Steve Jobs, who is suspected to have had Asperger's. If you include the 18 people highlighted there, 13 of the 18 people were either diagnosed as being on the spectrum or suspected to have been on the spectrum, which is pretty amazing. And there was never a brief, or at least I never read about a brief, that we're looking for people on the spectrum. They were looking for people that thought differently.
Basically, Alex saw that one of the most famous advertising campaigns, a campaign that inspired him, was, potentially the direct result of creatives, innovators, experts, intellects who were all living on the spectrum.
So as Alex mentioned earlier, the autism spectrum looks different from person to person. So we asked him to tell us more about his two sons, Greg and Oscar, and we wanted to hear more about his experience as a parent of two children on the spectrum.
They're complete opposites of one another. Oscar is 3, Greg is 5. Greg is he's non-verbal, although it's amazing. It's actually changed. In last month, he's starting to say individual words. And we're not quite sure if it's in the context of a broader meeting or whether he's repeating things, but he is attaching context to some words. So it's starting to happen. It's kind of exciting to see that there's a possibility that he might talk. But he's very gentle. He's very quiet. Oscar is the opposite of that. He's like a walking explosion. He wakes up and makes sure everyone's is awake. He has a speech delay, but his connection is much more prominent than Greg's is. Greg does have eye contact now, and he's starting to. I mean, the poor kid, in the sense that he's been in school since 2. He does more work than anybody I know. Oscar is kind of at the age now where we're going to understand. Things bubble up around the age of 4, and they start to happen then. So it might regress, it might not, but we have them involved with specialists now. Greg has an affinity for letters and numbers, and he's done some pretty spectacular things. And it's really funny. We overinvest in specialists with him. People, he's at various different centers. People come to see him in our home. And then sort of one day we walk in and he has the whole alphabet assembled, and no one ever taught him the alphabet kind of thing. And then he started putting words together, and then I kind of let him type in my computer, and he started to write out words, and some of them had context. In fact, the first time that he said mom or mama and papa was when he typed it on his computer, which is pretty spectacular. It's kind of neat to see that.
Alex and his wife have done a lot of research on how to raise children who are on the spectrum. So we asked him for his best piece of advice for other parents who might be in the same situation.
Get over the denial as quickly as you can. The most malleable age for kids is between 2 and 6. If you're going to wait for it to go away, as many parents do, it doesn't, and it's not. And you've missed the most crucial window to affect. Development up until the age 2 is pretty uniform, unless there's a very severe disability from birth. If you help them to develop some of these core life skills of just being, you really have done a lot in this sort of window of 4 years. And if you wait, it'll be too late at that point. You're just going to be really focusing on quality of life at that point, and it really isn't about helping them to thrive for themselves. It's about what can you do that they enjoy their time as best as they can in the environment they're going to be in.
So we finished off the interview by asking Alex, what are your hopes and dreams for your sons at a time when the autism spectrum is beginning to be a bit more understood and is beginning to, be viewed and thought of differently?
Honestly, I want them to be happy, and I want to be able to sit down and have a chat with my boys. It's pretty simple.
We want to thank Alex Shifrin for joining us on our first podcast episode, and to you for listening.
And don't forget to check out the animated version of this episode, which you can find on the Thought Cafe YouTube channel.